Okay, thank you very much, Fiona. And I'd like to actually acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting this morning as well, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And in my teaching, I always very much emphasize right at the beginning to consider the diversity, the richness, and the very close linkages between Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people and the land of Australia, which actually was the reason for 40 to 60,000 years of not just surviving on this continent, but actually flourishing over that time. And the theme of my talk today is really to bring in many of the things that Clarence shared with us this morning, and thinking about what do we need to do in terms of the future, that the challenges of which we've just heard very clearly and very wonderfully in terms of understanding from Leslie. Thank you so much, Leslie. So I'll just want to say this quotation because it comes from the United Nations, a document called The State of the World's Indigenous Peoples. And it's one sentence that can characterize in many indigenous peoples throughout the world, in that they have a deep spiritual relationship with the land. They feel at one with their ancestral territory and feel responsible for the healthy maintenance of the land, its waters and soils, its plants and animals, for both themselves and future generations. Land is where their ancestors are buried and where sacred places are visited and revered. And this spiritual connection with land is very much underpinning the importance of that survival and that flourishing over that tens of thousands of years. And this diagram here, it comes from the NHMRC, a roadmap for working within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. And just this simple map, I think, really emphasizes the values that underpin that relationship that was described in the previous slide. In that, in the center being its spirit and integrity, which is actually enhanced through interactions with the environment and with each other that are based on reciprocity, that is a giving and a taking, respect, equality, survival and protection, and responsibility. And if we think about just those 5 core values, we can understand how we can grow spirit and integrity both within our social, between each other, as well as in our relationship with the environment. But we haven't done that in many ways we haven't used those values to actually drive our policies and decision making. And I put up this slide. Leslie has already gone in quite depth explaining the relationship between what we do in terms of carbon emissions on the top, whether we control in the blue line and decline over time, or if we just continue to go upwards, and what that means for our temperature. I put this here just to emphasize the importance of us talking and communicating with each other, because this takes me back to a Parramatta Climate Commission presentation, which actually said to me, okay, I've got to start doing something. That Leslie actually presented that night, and that night very much changed my life, and the importance at which I put climate change into my work and my free time and everything I actually do in my life. So we can't underestimate the important impact we have on each other. And I just want to highlight here that this is still actually up on the web from the Australian Parliament, and it's a statement that says, in response to this risk, we are faced with 2 options: mitigate or adapt. In practice, both of these approaches will be required in our strategy to deal with climate change. And the point of what I'd like to talk about today is that this is a later rendition of that same concept of the choices we have in terms of controlling emissions and heading towards a world that's different, but doesn't look all that different from our current life, or towards something that really is vastly different, and in which flourishing, even surviving, will be a challenge. But what I'd like to do as well is to look at those two and think about another issue, which is all the other environmental requirements that we have for good health and well-being. And so in addition to the climate change issue, we also have many struggles in terms of the environment and maintaining good health. And this is an excellent diagram from WHO, which breaks down all sorts of pressures that humans are putting on the environment and what that means in terms of ecosystem impairment and resulting health impacts. It's quite similar to what Leslie said for climate change alone, but we're talking about a whole array of environmental challenges that we're facing at the same time. So what I'd like to suggest is that in terms of policies, we actually think about a third. It's not just mitigation and adaptation, but actually putting something in between there, which is actually the protection and healing of environmental and social capital. Because without that, whether we're living in the blue area, in the more favorable option in terms of temperature rise or the negative one, people in the future will struggle from that range of environmental changes that we're exerting on the environment. So I think that those three, if we can think about not just two, but a third core process in protecting health in a climate changing world, future generations will be glad that we do. But we all know that what's happening in the country today, that Australia is not protecting its environmental capital, and fossil fuels have become almost a king or a driver. Now, as we know from the G20 and the things we've been hearing about China and changes in coal use, etc., and a seminar we heard, a fantastic seminar last week with Tim Buckley from the at the Institute for Environmental Studies, it appears that coal is having a really hard time, and it's on perhaps a downward spiral in terms of being, or at least a lessening in terms of its impact on climate change. But there's another new kid on the block that I think we really have to keep our eye on very carefully, and that's the unconventional gas industries. And in this short talk, I don't have time to go into that, but if I can just highlight a couple of things about it, which concerns me greatly. New South Wales is faced with coal seam gas mining, and other states shale gas and tight gas. And it's sort of being proposed, you can hear it in a lot of things that are being said, that it's a clean and green, safe bridging tool. But this is anything but a safe and bridging fuel. We hear a lot about just fracking itself, which is shown on the left there, but in fact, this industry brings a whole gauntlet of changes in terms of both individuals, in terms of the industry itself, but also its impacts right across what we call the ecological model of health that we depend on for good health. And I'll just highlight two very important studies. There's been many others besides these two. The one on the top is a very elegant modeling presented in Nature, which basically concluded a limited impact on decadal scale climate change from increased use of natural gas. So whenever you hear gas is going to be a bridging fuel, it's going to take us safely across the channel till we can truly change. This one actually says no for a few reasons. There are technical reasons between fugitive emissions, but also in economic pressures that are holding renewable energy back. And on the bottom there, there's a very growing body of literature in the United States that is revealing great concerns regarding unconventional gas drilling in terms of public health for a range of reasons. So we mapped these range of reasons last year and sort of proposed them and mapped them around in the middle, which actually says what are the risks of coal seam gas. On the outer edge, it's actually about our basic needs in terms of good public health. And you can see the array from water, air quality, water quantity, water quality, to security of climate, to security of our landscape, our food production, etc. So any of those, we can argue about any individual ones, but when we actually map the whole array of risks and concerns that unconventional gas poses on people, we can see this is a very serious array of challenges that, should we go forward in this country as they have in the United States, we'll be dealing with too. And just a quick graph here showing that in Queensland, in the Tara, Chinchilla, Roma, the 5 communities there, this study by CSIRO actually found that about, when asked how well is the community adapting to the coal seam gas industry here, almost 50% were saying they were only just coping or worse in terms of that industry in their community. With about 40 to 50% saying it was adapting, but right here you can see less than 10% of those communities are actually felt they were changing to something different but better. So this is something that's being forced upon our rural area. Well, the adaptation is not something people are seeing as taking them to a better world. And I'm conscious of time here, so I wanted to say something about mental health, which Leslie introduced, but this comes from a document called the Psychological Impacts of Climate Change. And from that document in the black are what Doherty and Clayton said in terms of climate change. But if we start to think about what's happening on the ground in terms of fossil fuel development, we can see many, many other pressures on mental health and well-being. But I think in terms of what we can do, and the CSIRO report also indicated that when people actually get together and they start to work together to honor their own goals, their own values in terms of quality of life and social justice, they actually gain empowerment with each other, which actually can give them more resilience against what's going on in their communities. And just looking about what's going on around us very much more frequently these days is really people getting together and doing things, whether it's about a coal mine or a coal seam gas proposal or things like, or climate change itself. We are coming together and we are finding those common values between us. And so the question is, can we redress the balance between the quantity and material quality of human life versus the ecological health and the intangible quality of human life that we so enjoy. So I have 6 just messages for, urgent messages for policy here suggested. One is stop hiding public health in the social basket of environmental decision making. Health is a fundamental human value with a sophistication that requires its own consideration. You'll often find in these documents, these decisions, you will not find the word health in terms of what proposals that are being put forward. Also recognize and admit that an unconventional gas is neither a safe nor a bridging fuel between coal and renewables. It is a health and future damaging fuel that could be potentially on par, even if a little bit better. It's not enough and better than coal, and instead the comparison should be made with renewables rather than coal. 3, just accept and admit that health depends on the protection and healing of environment and social capital. 4, that add a 3rd climate response stream to mitigate and adapt, and that is to heal and protect the environment. It's often not part of these proposals thinking about the future and what people in the future will be needing, access to clean water and air, etc. And 5, recognize renewables, which we'll hear a lot more about right now. And 6, to place Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, survival, and protection at the core of policy, practice, and decisions. And I think that's a real important message that we can keep looking back at and keep pushing forward in terms of future survival. And thank you very much.